Welcome to this bedtime biography by Blinkist. Vindication, A Life of Mary Wollstonecraft by Lyndall Gordon. Narrated by Karen Cass. Today, Mary Wollstonecraft is enshrined in history as a hero of the women's rights movement. Perhaps even the very first feminist. She was, in her own words, the first of a new genus, a woman who dared to question the reigning belief that women were born inferior to men. Wollstonecraft's most famous piece of writing, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, made her a celebrity both in her own time and after her death. But what inspired Mary to fight so spiritedly for women's emancipation? What life experiences shaped her views? Find out in this bedtime biography. Chapter 1. Mary Wollstonecraft's righteous indignation took root early in her childhood. Her home was a tall brick house on Primrose Street, London. Today, the area is packed with high-rise office buildings and a bustling subway station. But in Mary's time, it was a quiet, charming residential neighborhood. Unfortunately, the area's quaintness wasn't matched by the environment inside Mary's home. As the eldest daughter of 7 children, Mary bore the brunt of her mother's discipline. Elizabeth Wollstonecraft trained her daughter to be obedient, like a dog. Mary was made to sit silently for long stretches of time, 3 to 4 hours, even as a young child. Despite these questionable parenting methods, Mary still had tender feelings for her mother. It was a different story with her father, the household's resident despot. Edward John Wollstonecraft was an aspiring gentleman, yet he failed in every respect. His financial endeavors amounted to nothing. He abused alcohol, and he assaulted his wife. The young Mary, in a bid to protect her mother, would sometimes sleep on the floor directly outside her parents' room. Other times, she would throw herself in front of her mother to redirect her father's blows to herself. Edward's violent outbursts were unpredictable, and the family lived life constantly on edge. As she grew older, Mary began to see her mother as a woman caged in by her marriage and the laws surrounding it. At that time, when women married, they gave up their right to earn their own income, could not get divorced, and had no legal recourse for marital abuse. As a teenager, Mary didn't waste time looking for a husband. Instead, she sought the perfect friend. A somewhat jealous and possessive girl, Mary wanted someone who would put her above everyone else. Eventually, she found the perfect candidate in Frances Fanny Blood, a slightly older village girl introduced to Mary by her neighbors. Mary adored Fanny from their very first meeting. She admired her elegance, artistic talent, and skill in caring for her brothers and sisters. Fanny agreed to become Mary's tutor, and their friendship blossomed like the wildflowers Fanny so skillfully drew. One of Mary's younger sisters, Bess, got married in October 1782. Mary frowned upon not just their union, but the entire institution of marriage. She believed that once the excitement and passion of the honeymoon period had worn away, only disgust would remain. She resolved never to marry, so as not to be, in her words, tied to this nasty world. But Mary had judged Bess's marriage incorrectly. It was, in fact, far worse than anything she could have imagined. Bess's husband wasn't physically violent, but he was deeply manipulative and sexually abusive. His treatment was so heinous that Bess's mental health suffered massively. She confided to Mary that she felt she would completely lose her sanity if she didn't leave her husband, but how could she do that, with no legal way out? At the age of just 24, Mary found herself secretly plotting to smuggle her younger sister out of her home with help from her other sister, Everina, her brother Ned's wife, and Fanny. One night, in the dead of winter, Everina and Ned's wife helped smuggle all of Bess's clothes out of the house. They passed them on to Fanny, who in turn gave them to a local brushmaker. Everina collected them from the brushmaker and then stored them at a secret location. Next, it was time to smuggle out Bess herself. That happened a few weeks later. The women needed a way to ensure that Bess's husband couldn't easily track them down. To that end, they planned to continually switch coaches while heading toward Hackney, a village north of London. The carriage shuddered and bumped along the road into town. En route, Bess grew so nervous that she quite literally bit her wedding ring to pieces. Her knuckles were stuffed inside her mouth for the entire journey. Upon reaching Hackney, Bess and Mary stowed away at a lodging house in the quiet part of town. Bess, oddly composed, wrote a letter to her husband explaining what she'd done, and then the two women waited. Bess's husband was enraged, and rumors soon began to spread. Mary was pinned as the shameful incendiary in the plot, a stain on her reputation that remains even today. Yet in reality, it was Bess, not Mary, who desired the marriage to end. Mary was simply the one who helped Bess's desires materialize. Despite the sorrow of having left her newborn child behind with her husband, the decision seemed to be the right one for Bess's mental health. Just days after the journey, Bess's extreme wretchedness had already begun to lift. The plot had succeeded. Now the question turned to finances. Bess no longer had the support of her husband. Mary was unmarried and, thanks to the law, had no right to her family's wealth. How could they generate an income? Chapter 2. In 1784, Mary and her sister Bess were two homeless, penniless young women with no work experience to speak of. And yet, they had one unexpected advantage. An old woman named Mrs. Berg, who appeared in their lives like a wizened fairy godmother. She provided the women with advice on how they could begin a school, despite the gaps in their education, and possibly also financial assistance. The women took Mrs. Berg's advice to heart, and they set up a school 2 miles north of London in Newington Green. Success came quickly. Mary and Bess were able to obtain 20 students in just 2 or 3 weeks of opening. Everina, Mary's other sister, joined them, as did Mary's dear friend Fanny. Mary may not have spoken French, known fancy needlework techniques, or had any skill in music or drawing, but she did have a mind overflowing with ideas about how women should be educated. She couldn't stand a system that taught women to simply repeat back the ideas they were told and never generate any of their own thoughts. She deplored the value society placed on trivialities like clothing and hairstyles. Instead, Mary wanted to set up a system that would teach her pupils how to think. Not just to learn by rote, but to compare and combine ideas in new ways. She taught students a simple, clear writing style, devoid of flowery language and Greek and Latin words intended to signal one's intelligence. And she emphasized the needs of individual students, avoiding a one-size-fits-all approach that would only benefit certain children. Importantly, Mary also centered domesticity in her work as an educator. She believed that emotional intelligence was not learned at school but at home. A loving, compassionate temperament could be instilled by a child's parents. Boys shouldn't be moved to boarding schools where they'd learn, in Mary's words, vice and tyranny. Instead, their mothers should serve as their primary educators, teaching them tenderness and kindness. The school allowed Mary to actualize her ideas on education, which were quite radical for the time, but the work also allowed her to financially support her sisters and Fanny. Through the school, this group of young women attained a measure of the independence that Mary had always hoped for. While at Newington Green, Mary also had to deal with a personal tragedy that profoundly affected her for the rest of her life: the illness of her friend Fanny. In early 1785, Fanny's health began to worsen. One day she spat blood, a sign of tuberculosis. The doctor's advice to Fanny was to seek out a warmer climate. Since Fanny's suitor, Hugh Scays, was working as a merchant in Lisbon, Portugal, Fanny decided to head there with Mary's blessing. In Lisbon, Fanny and Hugh married, and Fanny's health seemed to improve for a time. But only a month passed before Fanny discovered she was pregnant. Her uncertain health made the prospect of giving birth a potentially dangerous one. These fears came true as Fanny's health once again began to decline 6 months into her pregnancy. Soon after, Mary felt she had no choice but to help her friend through her illness, which meant leaving the school for a time. Despite the major disruption to her life, Mary was fiercely loyal. In September 1785, Mary sailed for Lisbon, a 13-day voyage from England. Fanny went into labor and gave birth to a baby boy the very same day Mary arrived. Mary, for her part, witnessed the delivery and then set to work immediately finding a proper wet nurse for Fanny's newborn. Fanny struggled for her life in the coming days, a time that Mary described as a terrifying dream. Mary prayed relentlessly for her dear friend's health, but alas, those prayers would go unanswered. Fanny died on November the 29th. Before Fanny was buried, Mary cut a lock of her hair and made it into a ring. A deep depression descended upon Mary, one that would never fully let up. Chapter 3. Mary's writing career kicked off while she was teaching at Newington Green. After classes finished for the day, Mary would spend her evenings penning her thoughts on education. These were later published in a book called Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. Eventually, Mary left the school and worked as a governess until she received a large sum of money from a friend. The money allowed her to begin paying off her debts, move to London, and finally pursue her writing career in earnest. It was here that Mary proclaimed she would become the first of a new genus, a single woman among an intellectual society made up mostly of men, a writer charting brand new territory. In January 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman was published. In it, she demanded justice for one half of the human race. Her arguments depicted modern women as silly creatures who were condemned to dress in ridiculous styles, remain ignorant, and depend on men. She railed against the marriage laws of the day, which policed both women's bodies and their property. At its core, Vindication returns to the arguments Mary laid out in her first published work, Education. Domestic affections, she writes, are the key to developing a person's mind. A proper domestic life can cut across the gender divide and help to establish a shared morality. This domestic ideology might not seem so revolutionary to us now, but Mary had ambitions of changing the entire world with it. An emphasis on motherhood and domesticity was feared at the time. Men didn't want to be seen as effeminate. However, Mary dreamed not of a world in which men were feminized, but one in which both sexes were politically empowered and taught the principles of kindness, compromise, nurture, and listening. If there's a single word that underpins the entire text, it's nature. Women, Mary argues, are not naturally inferior to men. They are merely constrained by a system that stunts their growth. Vindication ultimately sold about 3,000 copies. That wasn't a huge number, but the work transformed Mary into a veritable celebrity nevertheless. It entered mainstream British and American politics, and it was the first treatise on women's rights to do so. Groups of women debated it publicly, and thematic references to the work appear in Jane Austen's early novella, Catherine, and her later novel, Pride and Prejudice. Meanwhile, Abigail Adams, wife of American founding father John Adams, referred to herself as a pupil of Wollstonecraft. Naturally, not everyone's reaction to Vindication was positive. Thomas Taylor, a former landlord of the Wollstonecrafts, published an essay called A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes, which parodied Mary's work. And in some intellectual circles, people whispered their desire to burn effigies of Mary to show her just what they thought of her ideas. While Mary was writing, other global events were violently twisting the shape of history. One such event was the French Revolution, in which the reign of King Louis XVI was overturned and replaced by a new liberal democracy. Mary declared in 1792 her desire to travel to Paris. Her precise reason for going is unclear. She may have been fleeing from Henry Fuseli, a man who had rejected her advances, or she may have simply wished to see the revolution up close. Later, Mary described her trip to Paris as the only way to understand the most extraordinary event that has ever been recorded. The revolution, Mary soon discovered, was progressing much faster than she had previously thought. Austria and Prussia had declared war on France, and the revolutionaries there began to grow ever more suspicious of traitors. It wasn't long before the nation was transformed into a police state. This period, known as the Reign of Terror, caused thousands of innocents to be arrested and put to death by guillotine, simply because they were suspected of being anti-revolutionary. Britain was seen as an enemy of revolutionary France. As the terror grew in intensity, British supporters were increasingly considered treasonous. France was suddenly becoming a much more tenuous place for a young Englishwoman like Mary. Yet, rather than act cautiously and leave Paris with an Englishman who had an extra place in his carriage, Mary chose to stay. She still held on to the hope that the revolution would succeed, and she wished to further examine and write about the French temperament. It was around this time that Mary met an American frontiersman named Gilbert Imlay. Mary's heart quickly caught fire. Imlay was a living embodiment of the American ideals of freedom and equality. Moreover, he shared Mary's views on women's emancipation. His novels confronted issues like rape in marriage, women's education, and divorce laws. He, like Mary, abhorred slavery. He began pursuing Mary in mid-1793. Imlay was a complicated figure. a generous man with a strong sexual appetite. Before, Mary had argued against the constricting bonds of marriage, and yet she wished for permanence in her relationship with Imlay. Meanwhile, in France, the situation was growing even more dangerous for British citizens. Imlay, though, was an American, which meant he enjoyed greater standing and safety in the country. To help Mary, Imlay certified her as his wife with the American ambassador. This meant Mary became something of an honorary American as well. Through that act, Imlay may have saved Mary's life. A few weeks later, the French government announced that all foreigners from countries with which France was at war would be imprisoned. That didn't include Americans, which meant Mary was safe. She soon began referring to herself as Mary Imlay, even though no legal contract bound her to the man she so adored. Chapter 4. Mary's relationship with Imlay would not remain sweet for long. He was an enterprising man with little taste for domesticity, and he soon moved to Le Havre, a shipping port northwest of Paris. The distance between them grated on Mary, and she began to suspect him of having an affair. In addition, Mary discovered she was pregnant. On May the 10th, 1794, she gave birth to a little girl she named after her old great friend, Fanny Blood. While Mary's bond with her child grew inseparable, the opposite occurred in her relationship with Imlay. It turned out that Mary was right to suspect him of sleeping with other women. The discovery threw Mary into a deep depression, and Imlay's indifference drove Mary to attempt suicide on 2 separate occasions. In the midst of her relationship with Imlay, the Americans' business dealings enmeshed Mary in a clandestine plot involving a Norwegian captain and a ship full of illegal silver. Mary played a reluctant role as Imlay's ambassador of sorts, helping to protect his reputation with the Norwegian authorities. But she was disgusted by the seediness of the Scandinavian cities she stayed in, which she immortalized in a travelogue titled Letters Written During a Short Residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. After leaving Scandinavia, Mary travelled to Hamburg, Germany, which she also hated for what she perceived as the city's moral barrenness. When she finally returned to England, she encountered something much more pleasant, an old acquaintance named William Godwin, who was an anarchist political thinker. Mary and Godwin had met years earlier through a mutual friend. Back then, Godwin had had little interest in Mary and even found her distasteful. This time, though, things were different. Godwin read Mary's travelogue of Scandinavia and instantly felt his impression of Mary shift. He fell in love with her. Mary, still recovering from her tortured relationship with Imlay, found her heart pierced by this new man, a cool philosopher with an honest and intelligent character. She began visiting Godwin at his door, despite the social conventions frowning on such forward behavior by a woman. Their friendship grew by degrees and eventually blossomed into a deep romantic connection. Ultimately, Mary was persuaded to join him in marriage. A real one this time. Their relationship eventually resulted in a second pregnancy. In late August 1797, Mary gave birth to another little girl, also called Mary. That girl would one day grow into a woman named Mary Shelley, the author of the novel Frankenstein. But Mary Wollstonecraft would never get to read Frankenstein, nor get to know her newborn daughter. There was a complication during childbirth, and the operation, performed without an anesthetic, was an excruciating torture for Mary. When Godwin came to visit her afterwards, she told him, "I would have died, but I was determined not to leave you." The operation, however, had introduced an infection into her body. 3 days later, Mary began showing signs of sepsis, a life-threatening condition. As the sepsis spread, Mary, Godwin, and the doctors all knew she was dying. Days later, on September the 10th, 1797, Mary Wollstonecraft passed away. In his diary, Godwin wrote down the exact time of her death, followed by 3 wordless, excruciating dashes that cut across the page. After Mary's death, Godwin assumed responsibility for his wife's reputation. He set out to write a memoir of her life, yet in doing so he made a series of severe blunders. For starters, he had only been a part of Mary's life for a few years, so the memoir was unduly weighted toward the end of her life. And in gathering information and dates about the rest of her experiences, he neglected to contact Mary's sisters. He was unwilling to consider that they too felt the same pain over their loss. The result was a memoir that painted Mary not as a fierce, vindicated woman, but as a tortured soul gravely wounded by the mistreatment of her former lover, Imlay. The effects of this framing reverberated. Mary's affairs threatened to overshadow the other aspects of her legacy as feminist movements dismissed her as an overly emotional woman, or worse, a kind of prostitute. Associating themselves with her, they thought, would give people the wrong idea of feminism. It took years for Mary's reputation to recover, but finally, in the 19th century, her ideas began to gain traction again. One particularly influential figure in that regard was Robert Owen, a socialist whose followers circulated passages from A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Their efforts resulted in laws allowing women to join trade unions. Then there were the writers whose work glistens with Mary's influence. George Eliot, Charlotte Bronte, Emily Dickinson, Olive Schreiner, Henry James, and Virginia Woolf, who wrote her essay Mary Wollstonecraft in 1929. In it, she argued that Mary was still very much active and alive, and that her voice and influence continued to live on in the women's suffrage movements of the era. In Woolf's words, Mary's life was an experiment from the start. She was a pioneer who challenged conventions as well as succumbed to them. A woman whose genius was often scorned, and above all, a complex human being with flaws and strengths in equal measure.